Hi ladies and gentlemen, so today I'm going to be looking at classical conditioning. So when we look at learning, we need to remember that learning is a relatively permanent change in behaviour, and that's pretty much what you need to include with all your definitions of learning. It's usually as a result of experience. It continues right throughout your entire life and it allows you to adapt to new things in the world. Conditioning, on the other hand, is the process of learning and association between stimuli in the environment and behavioral response. So this will apply to both operant and classical conditioning. For example, for seeing your parents putting food on the table, you might know that it's time to go eat. So classical conditioning refers to a certain type of learning that occurs through the repeated association of two or more different stimuli. It was first described by Ivan Pavlov in his now famous Pavlov's dog's experiment. In the experiment, Pavlov taught his dog to salivate at the sound of the bell. Classical conditioning involves three phases: before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. Now, these particular ones are quite important. When you're going through your exam or a SAC and they ask about classical conditioning or you have to apply classical conditioning, you must, capital M-U-S-T, include before, during, and after conditioning. You have to have them in, especially if the question asks about terminology. You have to make sure that you include, the neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, all that sort of stuff. It must be included every single time. So, breaking it down. The unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that consistently produces a particular naturally occurring automatic response. In Pavlov's experiment, it was the food, and you need to know what Pavlov's experiments and Watson's experiments actually were. The unconditioned response is a reflexive involuntary response that is predictably caused by the UCS. In Pavlov's experiment, it was the salivation by the dog to the food. In the neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not produce a predictable response. In Pavlov's experiment, it was the bell. In the conditioned stimulus, is a stimulus that was neutral at first, but after conditioning produces a similar response to the UCS. The CS is the same thing as the NS, so for example, in Pavlov's experiment, it's still the bell. The conditioned response is a learned response that is produced by the CS. It is the same or similar to the UCR, but is produced by the CS alone. So in Pavlov's experiments, it's salivation by the dog to the bell alone. So you should actually just get a screenshot of that particular diagram. Make sure you know Pavlov's experiment off by heart. And you can see here that they've actually labeled before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. You have to make sure that you include it. You have to make sure that you label which one's the UCS, the UCR, the NS, the CS, the CR. You have to include it. You don't get the marks. You actually lose marks each time you don't use them. So once again, it's all broken down for you here, right? And you can see how it sort of is structured. So some of the terms that are associated with classical conditioning is each presentation of the NS with the UCS is referred to as a trial. This is a term that comes up quite a lot, and it's acquisition. An acquisition is the overall process during which a person or animal learns to associate the two events until the NS alone produces the CR and therefore becomes a CS. You need to use the word acquisition. Okay, so stimulus generalization is the tendency for another stimulus that is similar to the original CS to produce a response that is similar to the CR. The response tends to be weaker than the actual CS. For example, Pavlov's dogs, having learned to salivate at the sound of a bell, might also salivate at the sound of a doorbell, which is similar. In stimulus discrimination, they can respond only to the CS and not to any other stimulus that is similar. It is the opposite of stimulus generalization. Extinction is another term that's used quite a lot, and actually VCAT tends to put this on exams quite a bit. So the condition response may not always be permanent. Extinction is the slow decrease in the strength or rate, I'm terrible at highlighting, of a CR. This happens because the UCS is no longer being presented alongside the CS, which is the bell. Right? So if you stop doing it after a while, you're not going to be conditioned to the bell, or the dog's not going to be conditioned to the bell. Think about school bells whilst in lockdown. It'll take a while, over the couple of weeks of being in lockdown, that you'll no longer be conditioned to, want to eat at a certain time because the bell usually told you when to eat. However, over time, it might actually get to a point and you'll go back to school and you'll hear the bell and you go, ooh, I'm hungry now. And this is spontaneous recovery. So extinction is not always permanent. So spontaneous recovery occurs when the CR appears when the CS is presented. So for example, the bell might ring again just off the off chance and the dog starts salivating. Or the school bell rings and you all of a sudden feel hungry. Right? It tends to be weaker than it originally was, and it gets removed fairly quickly. So this is the table, and I have seen this in an exam. It's very mean to put it in, but I have seen it. Usually it's asking you to describe what it's telling you. So if you can see here, these are the trials. So this is how many times they've actually done it over the time period. So on that first day, they did up to 0 technically, to 22. And when they paired it, so drops of saliva produced by the CS, so this is the dogs. On the first day, or on the first trial, wasn't very much. Second, it started to increase. By about the 4th day, we're talking about 5 or 6. By about, let's go to the 5th, there's about 10 drops of saliva. On the 6th, and you can see that it's increasing because there's more of an association between the bell and food. So they keep pairing the bell and then presenting the food. And this is the acquisition stage. So it's still happening. Then what's happened is they will present the bell, but they won't actually present any food. It still produces a response, but this response after, let's have a look, between 16 and 20, I'm going to go actually 19, right? The dog starts to realize, I'm not going to get fed if that bell is rung. It might have a brief period where, wait, the bell, will I get fed? Will I get fed? Oh, no, right? And then it just gets worse and worse. Then they'll come back the next day and they'll go, oh, I remember this. If the bell goes, I get fed. And so they'll have a reaction. So this is spontaneous recovery. And it'll end up going down because they realize, well, no, I'm not going to get fed. And then after the 24 hours again, so 48 hours later, right, it'll start getting worse and worse. So this period is the extinction period. This stage here is extinction. This is the next day, and you must always try to extinguish any kind of learnt behaviour. And this is what has generally happened. Now, in the little Albert experiment, he didn't do that, which is very bad and an ethical issue. The little Albert experiment was a famous experiment performed by John Watson in 1920. It would not be ethically allowed. Watson used classical conditioning to develop a fear response in little Albert. I've had people in the past get this one wrong because they've said it was operant conditioning. It wasn't. So little Albert was an 11th-month-old baby boy, and Watson presented Albert with a white rat. He also showed them a whole bunch of different things as well, but little Albert actually liked the white rat, in theory. After taking the rat away, Watson then struck a hammer with it on a steel bar behind Albert's head, which produced a fear response. So every time he went to reach for that rat, Watson would be a mean old man and he would hit a bar behind his head, so he didn't know it was coming. And he did this again and again and again. So this was the acquisition stage. He repeatedly associated the rat with a very loud sound. So he's paired the rat with the noise so that every time Albert went to touch the rat, the noise would sound behind his ear. Eventually, due to classical conditioning, little Albert learned to associate the loud noise with the rat, until the rat alone, which had previously shown no fear, produced the fear response. So he would actually fear the rat. And he started to have stimulus generalization, where he actually feared everything that was white. So if we have a look at this, this is pretty much how it worked out and how it's broken down using the correct terminology. Once again, have a look. Before conditioning, during conditioning, after conditioning. You have to have these. If they say, what is the terminology? You must actually have those words in there. So I'm not going to continue highlighting, but you get the drift. Ethical implications. Breached so many. Informed consent is one of them. Albert's mother was a worker at the clinic where Watson worked. Now, a lot of people get this question wrong and they say, well, Albert was too young to give consent. Parents can give informed consent. Think about all the times that your parents have had to sign, permission slips for you to go on excursions. You haven't given consent, but your parents have. So that is not the issue. It's not that the kid didn't give consent. It was that the mother may not have given consent. So she did volunteer Albert for the experiment. So she did that. But it's thought that she didn't know that Watson would be creating a fear response in her son. So there are no records of informed consent. Informed consent means that they know what's going to happen in the experiment. There are no records about withdrawal rights. So because the mum wasn't actually present when this experiment was taking place, she didn't know that something was going on and couldn't withdraw her child. The fear response was never extinguished. And there is a good chance that little Albert suffered lasting psychological harm until he died a couple of years later. Ethical values such as research, merit and integrity, beneficence, justice and respect for human beings would all have been breached if the experiment had been performed today. But they didn't exist then. But still. Alright, so this is the last slide and just gives a different example. So if you happen to look at it, Geronimo is a puppy. He loves playing in the front yard of the big house that he lives in. One day, Geronimo runs out into the road in front of the house. A car slams on the brakes, making a loud screeching noise, and blares its horn, just stopping before it hits Geronimo. The noise gives Geronimo a fright, and he runs off yelping. The next day, the same thing happens with another car. After this, Geronimo becomes scared of the road and refuses to go anywhere near it. So, if we happen to have a look at it, the UCS is the loud noise, car nearly hitting him. The UCR means that he was scared. But the road was the neutral stimulus to begin with. If you have a look at it, the road then becomes a CS, and scared of the road instead of the noise becomes a CR. And it's all in here. So you might get a question like this on the exam. Actually, what am I saying? You will get a question like this on the exam. And you need to break it down, and they'll ask you to do this, to be able to put it in to the correct terminology, right? So you'll need to put all this information here into that. And you have to use before, during, and after. You have to use the UCS, all that sort of stuff there. It's just part of it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.